She broke into my cabin to inspect a doormat and walked straight into a SWAT sting she was never meant to see. The mountains were supposed to be peaceful. That's why I bought the old cedar cabin on Ridgepine Lake. Quiet mornings, empty trails, and zero drama. But drama has a way of tracking people down. In my case, it came wearing oversized sunglasses, a neon clipboard, and a haircut so sharp it could slice concrete. Her name was Corinne Milford, the president of the Ridgepine HOA. She knocked on my cabin door at 7 a.m. every Saturday to remind me about rules I'd apparently broken. Grass too tall. Fence too short. Doormat too large. Even my cabin smell once made her file a complaint, so when I left for a week-long work trip, I knew she'd snoop. But I didn't think she'd cut the padlock and break inside, and she definitely didn't know who was waiting for her on the other side. While I was gone, Corinne claimed she suspected unauthorized renovations. Her solution: bring bolt cutters, march across my property, and break into my cabin for a health and safety inspection. By 10 a.m. Monday morning, she was live commenting into her phone for an HOA Facebook group of 7 people. Entering the cabin now. Smells musty. Probably mold, she said, stepping over the lock she just destroyed. But she had no idea she had just walked into a federal sting operation. My cabin wasn't empty. Inside were men in full tactical gear. Because for the last 3 months, I had been letting my brother, an undercover federal agent, use my cabin as a safe house during a classified operation, and Corinne had just trespassed into the middle of it. The moment Corinne pushed the door open, she froze. 5 figures in matte black tactical armor turned toward her, helmets reflecting the harsh beams of their flashlights. Laser scopes jittered across the dim living room like skittering red insects, dancing over the walls, the furniture, and then, unfortunately, her forehead. Corinne made a sound that could only be described as a cross between a shriek and a yodel. Somewhere outside, a crow startled mid-flight and spiraled dramatically into the hedges, as if personally victimized by her vocal cords. For half a second, nobody moved. Then all hell broke loose, down ONTHE ground. One of the agents thundered, his voice amplified by the helmet's speaker. Corinne dropped her casserole dish. Yes, she'd brought a casserole, and it exploded across the hardwood like some sort of domestic crime scene. Cheese shrapnel everywhere. I'm the HOA president, she sobbed, staggering backward. I have authority. The agents did not, in any measurable sense, care. One of them barked something into a shoulder radio. Another swept behind her with frightening speed. Before she could even finish reciting subsection 4B of the Community Access Policy, Corinne was face down on the floor, knees shaking, arms yanked behind her. Zip ties clicked tight. Her indignation did not. "This is illegal," she wailed, kicking her feet uselessly as 2 armored agents held her down. "I will be filing a formal complaint, and a sub-complaint about the complaint process itself." "Ma'am, stop resisting," one agent said, sounding more exhausted than angry. "I'm not resisting, I'm expressing myself. There is a difference, look it up." Her voice cracked on the last word, partly from panic and partly because she'd run out of breath. Honestly, even the drywall looked annoyed. The agents exchanged a look, one of those silent, weary conversations conducted through the subtle tilt of a helmet. The kind that said, "Why do we get paid the same as the guys who raid warehouses full of actual criminals?" Finally, as the kicking and screaming slowed to a mere vibrating whine, Corinne seemed to deflate. A long, trembling exhale escaped her. "Are those boots regulation length?" she muttered bitterly into the floor, "because they look too long." The agent restraining her sighed like a man rethinking his career choices. When Corinne was finally calm enough to sit up, still zip-tied, still trembling with outrage, the lead agent approached her. He crouched down, visor reflecting her blotchy, tear-streaked face. "Ma'am," he said with a carefully measured patience, "you just broke into an active federal operation." "It wasn't posted," she snapped. If an operation is happening inside the community, you are required to file notice with the HOA president 72 hours in advance unless it is an emergency, in which case you must file post-operation paperwork within 14 business days. You people cannot just operate all over the place like this. He stared at her. She stared back, absolutely confident she had just recited a real rule and not something she'd invented 10 seconds earlier out of pure adrenaline. The casserole continued cooling, sadly, between them. "Right," the agent finally said. "We'll take that under advisement." He stood, muttering something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like, "I miss undercover cyber assignments." After a moment he walked toward the hallway, tapping his comm. "Target secure. Neighborhood variable neutralized." Karen gasped. "Neutralized? I am not a variable. I am a pillar of this community. I keep the newsletter running. I track the recycling habits of every household on this street." One of the other agents whispered to another, "That actually explains a lot." When they finally decided she posed no actual threat, other than to mental stability and municipal harmony, they hauled her upright. She swayed, looking like a furious garden gnome someone had just uprooted. And that was when the lead agent contacted me. My phone buzzed while I was in line at the grocery store, trying to decide between two brands of salsa. I answered without checking the number, because that's what you do when people like Corinne exist in your life. "Is this you?" the caller asked, using my name. "Yes," I said, bracing myself. "This is Agent Ramirez with the let's just say the acronym is classified. Your HOA president broke into a federal operation. This is a new one." I looked down at the salsa jar in my hand. Medium heat, fitting. I wasn't even surprised. Of course Corinne had broken into a federal operation. Of course she had stumbled into a room full of armored agents while carrying a casserole. Of course she had declared herself the supreme ruler of the cul-de-sac in the face of men with laser sights. I sighed. "What did she do exactly?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer would be the verbal equivalent of a migraine. "We were conducting a controlled extraction," he said. "Your HOA president let herself in using a master key, ignored repeated commands, disrupted our sweep, and then started yelling about lawn standards. Something about edging requirements." "Yep," I said, "that sounds about right." "She also attempted to cite us," he added carefully, "for improper foot traffic on common property." I pinched the bridge of my nose. Did she mention the decorative rock rule? "No," he said, sounding wary. "Should she have?" "She will," I said. "Give it time." There was a long pause on the line. The kind of pause where you can hear a grown man reconsidering his life choices. "We're releasing her," Ramirez finally said. "She's unharmed, just extremely vocal." "You should warn your team," I said. "She files paperwork like it's an Olympic sport." "We noticed," he said with the hollow tone of someone who had just been handed a stack of forms they didn't deserve. When I arrived to pick her up, Corinne was still mid-rant, packing in small, furious circles near the curb. Her hair frizzed out like she'd been electrocuted by pure indignation. The zip ties were gone, but she held her wrists out dramatically anyway, as if still shackled by injustice. "There you are," she snapped the moment she saw me. "Do you know what they did to me? Me, the president, they forced me onto the floor. They threw my casserole into the abyss." "It shattered on the ground," I reminded her gently. "The abyss," she repeated louder. Two agents nearby flinched. She leaned in, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "And they didn't even wipe their boots before entering the house. I checked. Mud. Actual mud." I looked over at Agent Ramirez, who stared back at me with the exhausted, hollow expression of a man who had just lived through something that would haunt the rest of his career. "Good luck," he mouthed. I nodded sympathetically. Corinne, meanwhile, marched toward my car like a general returning from a particularly petty war, "Take me home," she demanded. "I need to draft a letter." Of course she did. I opened the passenger door for her. As she climbed in, muttering about due process and decorative mulch, I realized something profound. The federal agents might have had body armor, state-of-the-art equipment, and years of tactical training. But they had just encountered something far more powerful. Karen, and not even the government was prepared for that. By the time I returned to Ridgepine Lake, the story had already spread across town, like gossip carried on the wind, gathering details the way a rolling snowball gathers debris. And just like a snowball, it grew less accurate with every rotation. At the gas station, an old man leaned against the pump and squinted at me with a suspicion usually reserved for UFO abductees. "You hear about that woman arrested by the feds?" he asked, unprompted. I nodded carefully. "Which woman?" "The HOA lady, Karen something. Saw the whole thing go down. Heard she was a Russian double agent or maybe Canadian. Hard to trust Canadians, they're sneaky polite." I politely declined to explore that reasoning any further. At the grocery store, the cashier whispered, "Did you know she tried to overthrow the mayor? My cousin's babysitter knows someone on the police force who said they caught her mapping out the whole town with color-coded pins." "That sounds elaborate," I said. "She used a corkboard," the cashier added gravely, as if that sealed the truth. But the rumors only got stranger from there. A group of teenagers skateboarding near the library told me she'd been involved in a secret suburban militia dedicated to enforcing lawn height regulations through tactical intimidation. Someone else insisted she had been attempting to hack into the town's sprinkler systems to control rainfall distribution. And at least 3 different people said she had been detained for attempting to steal classified artifacts, which I eventually learned was their dramatic interpretation of her taking home the HOA's binder of landscaping citations. The actual events were significantly less cinematic. Karen had been fined, heavily. The government does not, as it turns out, appreciate having surprise civilians explode into their operations like angry glitter bombs. She had been detained for questioning for several hours, though most of that time was spent with her lecturing federal agents about shrub symmetry and trash bin placement. Her greatest punishment, however, came from closer to home. She was banned from serving on the HOA board for life. When the news broke, half the neighborhood gasped. The other half openly celebrated. Mrs. Langford from 2 houses down actually baked cupcakes and passed them out like it was the 4th of July. Someone drew "Freedom" in big chalk letters across the sidewalk. The Ridgepine Lake HOA collapsed within a week. As it turned out, no one actually wanted to be in charge. Everyone had simply been too afraid of disappointing Karen to resign. The treasurer quit to pursue inner peace, which he explained meant kayaking and ignoring emails forever. The secretary simply left the state. And without Karen's relentless rule enforcement, her morning patrols, her clipboard cross-checking, her uncanny ability to sense when a trash can was left out longer than municipal code allowed, the neighborhood fell into a peaceful, slightly disorganized bliss. Flower beds were allowed to grow a little wild. Kids left chalk drawings on driveways without fear of reprimand. Someone even placed a garden gnome shaped like a pirate in their yard, an act that would have previously resulted in a 15-minute tirade about unsanctioned ornamentation. And me, somehow my cabin became a sort of local legend. People approached me at diners, hardware stores, even while fishing off the dock. "You're the cabin guy," they'd say. At first, I wasn't sure what that meant. But apparently, the story solidified into this. My cabin had indirectly overthrown the most oppressive HOA leader in Ridgepine history. I hadn't done anything intentionally, but the town was determined to crown me a hero of passive resistance nonetheless. A local conspiracy blogger even posted a video titled "The Cabin That Fought Back," a deep dive, complete with dramatic music and stock footage of eagles soaring majestically. I finally returned to my property one quiet afternoon, hopping for normalcy. The front door was still damaged from Karen's enthusiastic entry. The lock hung twisted, screws bent at odd angles like they'd been trying to escape. I rebuilt the broken lock with a sturdier model, the kind meant for tool sheds, bunkers, or houses that have experienced a Karen-level breach. Then I added a new sign to the door, a clear one, in bold lettering that even the most determined HOA official could not misinterpret. Private property. Federally monitored. Trespass at your own risk. Was the cabin still federally monitored? Technically, no. But was I willing to let that myth die? Absolutely not. The mountains settled back into their usual rhythm, wind in the pines, birds gossiping in the branches, the lake stretching lazy and blue across the valley. Peace returned like an old friend who had been waiting just out of sight. Karen stayed in town for a while after the incident, though her presence faded noticeably. Without her HOA authority, she seemed adrift. I'd occasionally spot her at the grocery store, clutching a basket like it was a lifeline, staring longingly at organizational binders or muttering under her breath about the lack of community standards. But her threats carried no weight anymore. The neighbors she'd once terrorized with sternly worded notices now greeted her politely and kept walking, free at last from her tyranny of mulch and measuring tape. 3 months later, she moved away. Some said she relocated to a retirement community several towns over, one with a very strict HOA and a reputation for intense bingo competitions. Others claimed she went off-grid to start a new life in a cabin of her own, though I personally doubted her ability to survive without laminated rules and scheduled trash pickup. Whatever the truth was, she left Ridgepine Lake quietly, her car packed with the remnants of her once mighty rule. Binders, stamps, color-coded folders, and probably 7 different types of clipboards. I watched her drive out of town from the window of the diner one morning. She paused at the 4-way stop. Out of habit, she checked whether anyone else had rolled through without coming to a full halt. Then she turned left and vanished around the bend. Just like that, she was gone. And with her departure, a weight lifted from the community. The air felt lighter. The sunsets looked warmer. Even the mailboxes seemed to stand a little taller, no longer threatened with inspection. The mountains were peaceful again. And this time, it felt like the peace might actually last. Just when I thought everything had finally settled, when Ridgepine Lake had returned to its calm, pine-scented rhythms, and the memory of Karen's reign felt like a strange fever dream, I received a letter. It was wedged halfway under my cabin door, the corner curled like it had been pushed in quickly. There was no return address, no stamp. Whoever delivered it had done so in person. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. The envelope was stiff, high-quality paper, classy, expensive, the kind of stationery someone uses when sending either wedding invitations or deeply personal threats. Inside was a single sheet. 1 sentence, written in stern, precise, aggressively uniform handwriting. I'm watching your doormat. Okay. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I laughed, loud enough that it startled a squirrel off the railing outside. Of course she would send something like this. 3 months gone, an entire town collectively healing from her presence, and still Karen managed to extend her influence like some kind of suburban poltergeist haunting household accessories. I read the line again, imagining her sitting at a spotless desk in a brand new neighborhood, wearing her reading glasses, tongue probably peeking out of the corner of her mouth as she printed the message with military precision. I'm watching your doormat. Not the cabin. Not me. Not the property line, or the trash bins, or the siding. The doormat. To Karen, the doormat was the soul of a home, a symbol of order, first impressions, and foot traffic compliance. She once fined a neighbor for having one that said "go away," because it was antagonistic to community cohesion. So the fact that she had chosen that object as her final battleground made perfect, absurd sense. But the difference now: nothing she could do, no letter, no threat, not even a surprise inspection, held any real power anymore. She could glare at my doormat from a telescope halfway across the state, and all she'd accomplish was fogging up her own eyepiece with frustration. Still, curiosity tugged at me. I stepped outside and looked down at the mat. Brown, worn, a little frayed around the edges. It said "welcome," mostly because I hadn't bothered to replace it since buying the cabin, and partly because the SWAT guys thought it was hilarious to wipe their tactical boots on something so friendly. The forest was quiet, no sign of anyone watching, no rustle of bushes, no figure lurking behind a tree with a clipboard. Just wind drifting through the pines. Just peace. I folded the letter and slipped it into my pocket, a souvenir. Back inside, I sat at the little wooden table by the window and thought about everything that had happened. How Karen's meltdown had accidentally turned me into a local hero. How the Federal Tactical Unit had adopted my cabin as their unofficial training hideout. How Ridgepine Lake was slowly relearning what it felt like to breathe freely. I chuckled again. Because if she ever tried breaking in again, well, there was still a SWAT team that occasionally used my cabin. They weren't always there, of course. Some days they were off training somewhere else, or running drills in secret underground facilities, or doing whatever federal agents do when they're not scaring the life out of HOA presidents. But they came back often enough. They show up early in the morning, unload gear, sit on my porch drinking terrible energy drinks, and nod at me like we were old coworkers who didn't know each other's names but respected each other's existence. One of them, Ramirez, once asked if I wanted to join a sparring session. I politely declined. But they liked the cabin, said it was quiet and remote, good cover, ideal for mock operations. They swept through the rooms with practiced precision, checking windows, mapping sight lines, cataloging exits. They replaced my back door with one that could probably withstand an explosion, just in case. And every time they left, the place felt even safer than before. Which made the idea of Karen sneaking back onto the property hilariously improbable. I pictured it vividly, her creeping through the woods in a beige cardigan, clutching a flashlight and a clipboard, muttering about non-standard exterior decor. Maybe stepping on a twig and immediately panicking. Maybe tripping over her own sandals. And then discovering 6 heavily armed agents in my living room, casually eating protein bars while running surveillance simulation drills. Oh, they would be thrilled to see her again. Absolutely delighted. In fact, I imagined the conversation. "Ma'am, put down the clipboard. This is a restricted area. Ma'am, we've told you before, stop trying to measure the door clearance. This violates subsection. Zip ties." Karen screaming about bylaws while being carried off like a particularly stubborn raccoon. The thought warmed my heart. I looked back at the letter, still sitting on the table. For a moment, the corners of my mind wondered if it was her version of closure. A final petty jab. One last attempt at superiority before she allowed herself to let go of Ridgepine Lake entirely. Maybe she'd written it dramatically, imagining me trembling at the cryptic threat. Maybe she stood in front of a mirror afterward, nodding with satisfaction at her own sternness. Really, it was almost sweet. In her own bizarre, regulation-obsessed way, Karen had given me a goodbye note. I folded it once more and placed it in the drawer beside the old Swiss Army knife and a stack of grocery store receipts, a tiny piece of history. The sun dipped lower outside the window, painting the treetops gold. The cabin creaked softly in the breeze, wood settling like an old friend stretching after a nap. Ridgepine Lake was calm again. Peaceful. Balanced. Maybe the mountains had always known how this would end. One overly controlling HOA president sent packing by the sheer force of her own chaos, leaving behind only a bizarre legacy and a beautifully quiet town. I locked the door, checked the doormat, then smiled to myself. Some people never change. But me. I no longer worried about Corinne. Because if she ever tried anything again, if she stepped one cardigan-covered toe onto my porch, if she lifted that clipboard toward my roofline, if she so much as breathed suspiciously near a property boundary, the federal agents would be more than happy to respond. And this time, they would inspect her with enthusiasm. A week after receiving Corinne's creepy letter, things around my cabin started getting weird. Not a raccoon knocked over the trash cans, weird. Not a bear wandered too close to the porch, weird. This was the kind of weird that settles deep in your spine and whispers, something isn't right. It began small enough I kept telling myself I was imagining things. First, there were footprints. Fresh ones. In the soft dirt around the cabin's back corner, where no one walked because it was basically a natural booby trap of roots and thorny underbrush. The prints weren't from hikers, hunters, or the tactical team. They knew better than to stomp around back there. These were smaller, lighter, almost careful. I crouched and examined one. It was faint but deliberate, like someone had placed their weight gingerly with each step. Then there were the branches. Not fallen, snapped. Clean breaks, shoulder height, forming a subtle path that curved through the pines behind the cabin. Something or someone had been moving through the woods with purpose. And then the perfume. It hit me one afternoon as I stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee. A breeze rolled past, carrying with it a scent so oddly out of place in the mountain air that I stopped mid-step. Sweet, sharp, cheap, drugstore floral, and unmistakably familiar. Corinne's special occasion mist. She had worn it to every HOA meeting, block event, and petty confrontation. If aggression had a fragrance, it was that overbearing bouquet. I stood still, sniffing the air like a confused bloodhound, while a cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. But none of that compared to what happened next. It was exactly 2:13 a.m. when I woke to the sound. A careful footstep. Then another. Slow, measured, almost investigative. Someone was circling the cabin. I held my breath, listening. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. My heart pounded so loudly, I was certain whoever was outside could hear it. I slipped out of bed, moving quietly across the cold floor. Every instinct in my body told me not to open the blinds, don't look, don't confirm. But curiosity is a powerful enemy of common sense. I lifted one corner of the blinds with trembling fingers. At first I saw only darkness. Then the moon slid from behind a cloud, washing the tree line in pale silver. And that's when I saw it. A silhouette. Tall, motionless. Just inside the line of trees. Watching the cabin. Watching me. I froze, breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, not even a shift of weight. It stood with unnatural stillness, as if carved from the very shadows around it. My skin prickled. I didn't know if it was Corinne. I didn't know if it was some stranger, or an animal, or something much worse. But the smell of perfume still lingered faintly near the window frame. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking so badly I had to try the passcode twice. My brother had a secure line, one the tactical team used when something serious came up. I hit the contact and pressed the phone to my ear, whispering so softly I barely heard myself. I think Corinne's back. His response came instantly, all sleepiness gone from his voice. Stay inside, lock the doors, don't move. We're sending a team. I swallowed hard. Hurry. I set the phone down and kept my eyes glued to the tree line. The figure didn't move, didn't tilt its head, didn't break its stance, just watched. My palms were slick with sweat. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. The cabin seemed smaller, tighter. The walls felt too thin. I reached for the fireplace poker, more symbolic than useful, but it felt better to hold something heavy. Minutes crawled by. The wind shifted, branches creaked, a distant owl hooted. But the figure stayed exactly where it was. And then, just when I heard the faint hum of vehicles approaching from the far road, the figure moved. Not quickly, not even threateningly. It simply stepped backward. Once, twice, and melted into the dark. By the time the tactical team arrived, flooding the clearing with beams of blinding white flashlights and commanding shouts, the woods were empty. Ramirez was the first through the door. "Where is she?" he demanded. I pointed toward the tree line. "She was right there, I swear." His eyes scanned the forest, sharp and practiced. His team swept the perimeter with a precision only years of training could produce. But they found nothing. No footprints. No broken branches. No perfume. Just calm, silent trees, which somehow made the whole thing 10 times worse. Ramirez stepped back inside, lowering his weapon but not his guard. "You said you thought it was Karen," he asked. "Maybe." I rubbed the back of my neck. It smelled like her perfume. Someone was definitely watching the cabin. It wasn't an animal. He nodded, jaw tight. "We'll run thermal scans, stay put." And they did, circling, searching, combing every inch of the surrounding woods. For over an hour they moved methodically, lights sweeping, radios crackling. But the figure was gone. Completely, like it had never been there at all. The team eventually regrouped near the porch. Ramirez looked uneasy, something I'd never seen in him before. "Whoever it was," he said, "they knew how to avoid us." A chill ran down my spine. He didn't say Karen. He didn't say a neighbor. He said whoever, someone capable, someone careful, someone trained even. I swallowed. "So, what do I do?" Ramirez glanced toward the woods once more before meeting my eyes. "Stay alert," he said. "Keep your lights on at night, lock everything, and if you see anything at all, you call us again." I nodded, but nerves buzzed beneath my skin. The team packed up and pulled out, their headlights disappearing down the winding road like the last trace of safety vanishing into the dark. I stood on the porch alone, listening to the quiet night. The pines swayed softly. A breeze carried the smell of damp earth. And somewhere buried beneath the natural scents of the mountain air, I could have sworn I still detected the faintest trace of cheap, floral perfume. The figure might have vanished, but the feeling of being watched, that stayed. The next morning, after the longest, most paranoid night of my life, I drove into town to gather supplies. Extra locks, motion lights, maybe a flamethrower if the hardware store carried one. Anything to make sure I didn't wake up at 2:13 a.m. again to find a human statue lurking in the pines. I was standing in the checkout line at Ridgepine Market, holding a basket full of batteries, duct tape, and a pack of beef jerky I didn't remember choosing, when I heard 2 people whispering near the magazine rack. "I still can't believe she did it," one woman said. "She never could handle being dethroned," her friend replied. I glanced over, expecting gossip about the mayor or someone's messy divorce, but then I heard the name. Karen. My spine stiffened. "She formed what?" the first woman asked. The other leaned in, voice dropping dramatically. "A new organization, some kind of rogue HOA." My head snapped toward them so fast I nearly gave myself whiplash. I stepped closer, pretending to examine a display of discounted sunflower seeds. "A rogue HOA. That was like saying a rogue librarian mafia or an extremist knitting circle. It sounded ridiculous until you remembered who we were talking about. The first woman laughed nervously, but she moved away. Why would she start an HOA here? Oh, she didn't call it an HOA, the second said. She named it something fancy, Neighborhood Preservation Task Force. I blinked. That was the most Karen name I had ever heard. Pretentious, overly formal, a title that implied authority she definitely did not have. And the kicker, she didn't even live in the neighborhood anymore. I stepped fully into the conversation before I could stop myself. Sorry, did you say Karen started a task force? Both women nodded sagely, like this was just another Wednesday in Ridgepine. Yep, the first said. Flyers went out yesterday. She's recruiting concerned citizens committed to maintaining community standards. The second wrinkled her nose. Mostly the old HOA diehards who miss threatening people over their mailbox decorations. Ah, yes, the bitter remnants of Karen's regime. The ones who once debated whether plastic flamingos violated the natural color palette rule. The ones who gave out passive-aggressive, friendly reminders with such frequency it became a town meme. Anyway, the first woman continued, rumor has it Karen wants to expand her jurisdiction. Expand to what? I asked, instantly regretting the question. They both looked at me like the answer was obvious. Your cabin, the second woman said. I felt my stomach drop. What, why? Well, she hesitated, then whispered. She said she still feels responsible for your property, says it's a threat to aesthetic harmony. It's a cabin in the woods, I said flatly. Exactly, she replied, as if that somehow supported Karen's argument. The first woman pulled out her phone and scrolled. Look, someone posted a picture of the flyer online. She held it up. I stared at it stunned. A stern serif font header declared, Neighborhood Preservation Task Force. Restoring order, ensuring compliance, protecting community values. Below it was an image of Karen, smiling with the kind of forced intensity that suggested she was 3 seconds away from issuing a citation. And under her picture, a bullet list. Property monitoring. Behavioral observation. Community enforcement patrols. Reclamation of neglected spaces. Reclamation. My cabin wasn't even in a neighborhood. It was half a mile outside town, surrounded by federal land and trees older than the United States. This is insane, I muttered. Oh, it gets better, the first woman said. She held an info meeting last night. And 15 people showed up. I groaned. Of course there were 15. That was exactly the number of people who previously argued about whether Halloween decorations were allowed before October 1st. So what are they doing now? I asked. The second woman shrugged. Meeting again tonight. Apparently she has a new mission. A mission? Her words, not mine, she said. Something about restoring order to properties that have fallen outside community oversight. I swallowed. The pieces clicked together sharply in my mind. The footprints. The broken branches. The perfume. The silhouette watching from the trees. Karen wasn't just lurking around my cabin on her own. She had help. Backup. An entire squad of disgruntled, clipboard-wielding suburban vigilantes. The thought made my skin crawl. I paid for my supplies quickly, nearly forgetting the jerky again, and hurried to my truck. As I drove out of town, my brain spun. Karen forming a rogue organization. People joining her. A task force with vague but dangerously enthusiastic phrases like monitoring and reclamation. It wasn't just Karen acting out anymore. Not just her bizarre attachment to my doormat or her obsession with authority. This was coordinated. Organized. A revenge plan disguised as community service. And if 15 people showed up last night, how many would show up tonight? How many already believed in her crusade for restoring order? How many would follow her into the woods to inspect my cabin? My phone buzzed as I turned onto the forest road. A text from Ramirez. Any more activity since last night? I stared at the screen, gripping the wheel tighter. I typed back, it's worse than we thought. Call me. Because Karen's shadow in the pines wasn't just the work of one obsessive ex-HOA president. It was the beginning of something bigger, something organized, something determined, something coming straight for my cabin. By the time the sun dipped behind the ridge and cast long shadows over the cabin, I was already exhausted. The day had been a carousel of grocery store rumors, paranoid glances over my shoulder, and the nagging certainty that Karen, banished, disgraced, and somehow more powerful than ever, was plotting something with her makeshift suburban militia. I pulled into the gravel driveway and immediately sensed something was off. The air felt too still, too quiet. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. I grabbed my bags, walked toward the cabin, and just as I reached the porch, I noticed it. A metallic glint near the door hinge. Small boxy, wrong. I froze so hard I'm pretty sure my spine locked up. At first I thought it was a spider, a very shiny, rectangular spider, but one cautious lean later my stomach plummeted. It was a device. A wired device. The kind of thing you see in those low-budget spy movies, where someone clearly watched a YouTube tutorial on top 10 homemade traps that might send you to jail. The wires were mismatched, electrical tape peeling off in places, and the casing looked suspiciously like it had once been a cheap garage door opener. But it had a trigger plate, and something that resembled a pressure switch. Definitely not a spider. I backed away like the door had transformed into a live cobra. Immediately, I called my brother. He picked up on the first ring. Tell me you're not calling because there's another raccoon inside. I wish, I said. There's a contraption on my front door, a wired device, like someone's science project decided to commit a felony. Silence, then a low curse. We're on the way. Don't touch anything, don't go inside, don't even breathe in its direction. Wasn't planning to. 15 minutes later, I heard the rumble of tires on gravel and the familiar synchronized footsteps of a tactical team that had become far too acquainted with my property. They approached with the kind of caution normally reserved for alien artifacts or Karen's annual HOA meetings. Their commander crouched near the device, squinting. After a moment, he sighed the sigh of a man who had given up trying to understand the stupidity of the human race. This is homemade, he said, like aggressively homemade. He gently lifted the device, nudged the wires aside, and found something taped underneath. A note, written in the same aggressively angry handwriting I'd seen on 100 HOA violation slips. If we can't inspect your cabin, no one can. K. The commander stared at the note for a solid 3 seconds before muttering, "Is this woman serious? Is she okay?" I shrugged. Her okay expired years ago. He removed the device carefully, disarmed it, not that it seemed particularly armable in the first place, and tucked it into a secure case. Then he stood up and looked around the property with a tight jaw. This isn't just harassment. This is escalation, and not the smart kind. He didn't need to explain. Karen wasn't just creeping around anymore. She wasn't just leaving footprints or perfume clouds or ominous letters. She had crossed over into full-blown, home-alone villain but worse at planning territory. The team exchanged glances, grim ones. "We're staying overnight," the commander said. "If they're bold enough to leave garbage like this on your front door, they're bold enough to come back." I wasn't about to argue with free protection from rogue suburban extremists, so I nodded. They set up around the property, silent, strategic, disciplined. while I sat inside trying to decide whether this situation was terrifying, ridiculous, or both. Probably both. Definitely both. The sky shifted from orange to purple to black as the forest wrapped itself around the cabin. Crickets chirped, something owlish hooted, and somewhere far away a twig snapped. The tactical team didn't relax once. Two stood watch on the porch. Another monitored the back trail. One took position in the tree line. The last sat inside near the window with night vision goggles that made him look like a cybernetic owl. Hours passed. Then at 1:47 a.m., everything went sideways. It started with a metallic ping. A small, sharp sound, like someone flicking a can. Every member of the team stiffened instantly. Then came another sound. Crunch, not a squirrel crunch, not a deer crunch. A heavy, deliberate human footstep. Then three more. I held my breath. The commander signaled silently. Two agents moved to flank the porch. Another raised his scope toward the tree line. A faint beam of cheap flashlight flickered between the pines, wobbling, frantic, like the person holding it couldn't decide if they were brave or terrified. Then the beam disappeared, followed by hushed voices. Then a shout, and then, boom, not a Hollywood explosion, but a loud, echoing blast that shook the pines and rattled my windows. Someone, somewhere just outside the property line, had triggered one of their own devices. The agents launched into motion immediately, sprinting toward the source of the explosion. I stayed inside, the floor vibrating under my feet, adrenaline burning through my veins. Minutes later, the commander returned, breath visible in the cold air. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "Karen's people set up multiple traps in the woods. One of them walked straight into their own tripwire." I blinked. "Are they okay?" "They're humiliated," he said. "Which is worse to them?" He rubbed his forehead in disbelief. "This isn't just a rogue HOA anymore. This is turning into a full-scale suburban insurgency." I knew then things were about to get much, much worse. The forest was unusually restless that night. Wind slid through the pines like it carried secrets, brushing against the cabin with a slow, uneasy rhythm. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee I didn't need, pretending to read while the tactical team rotated their watch shifts with military precision. By 11:45 p.m., the woods had gone so quiet that even the agents exchanged looks. Animals don't go silent unless something is moving through their territory, something, or someone. At midnight sharp, I heard it. A sharp rustle outside the cabin, then the crunch of weight shifting on loose gravel. Not wildlife, not trees. Intentional, the kind of sound made by people trying not to make sound. The commander raised a hand for silence. Footsteps approached, slow, cautious, whisper soft. We all moved closer to the front window, staying back behind the blinds. The room was so dark I could hear my own breathing, too loud, too obvious. One agent switched on his night vision goggles, the faint click sounding like a firecracker in the stillness. Then I saw them. Three hooded figures emerging from the shadows, like a budget horror movie ensemble. The first, tall and jittery, held a crowbar like he wasn't entirely sure which end went where. He kept glancing back at the woods, probably second-guessing every life decision that had led him here. The second had a flashlight whose lens had been covered in red tape, as if that made them more stealthy instead of looking like a middle schooler preparing for a haunted house. And the third, oh, I knew that posture anywhere. Karen wearing sunglasses, at midnight, in the forest. I had many questions, none of which I ever wanted answered. She crept forward with her chin lifted, posture stiff, scarf wrapped dramatically around her neck like she was leading an espionage mission instead of a suburban crime. She pointed at my window with authority, her voice cutting through the quiet in a sharp, hissing whisper. "Break it quietly," she ordered. "He won't even know we're inside." I glanced at the team. They all glanced back with identical expressions, equal parts disbelief, irritation, and the faintest twinge of pity. Here she was, banished HOA dictator turned rogue vigilante, trying to break into a cabin that housed federal agents, using 2 semi-competent recruits and a $7 crowbar from a bargain bin. Before the crowbar even reached the window frame, the world exploded into daylight. Floodlights blasted on with a thunderous electric hum. The forest lit up like a stadium finale. Karen shrieked so loud one of the agents actually flinched. And then from the shadows, the tactical team surged forward. It was a blur of black armor, boots, and controlled shouting, hyper-efficient, professional, utterly overwhelming. The 2 assistants tried to run, but their attempts were tragic at best. One tripped on a tree root instantly. The other managed 3 steps before being flattened by an agent who moved like a human missile. Karen tried to retreat too, but her scarf caught on a branch and jerked her backwards so violently she spun like a malfunctioning weather vane. She screamed, a high-pitched, metallic wail that sounded like a tea kettle being pushed beyond its physical limits. Her arms flailed wildly as the agents secured her. "I was just doing MY duty," she screeched, kicking at the air. "The cabin has violations, violations." The commander glanced at me as if mentally asking, "Is she always like this?" I nodded sympathetically. Unfortunately, yes. Once the situation stabilized and all 3 intruders were safely pinned, I stepped outside, folding my arms as the cold mountain air washed over me. Karen glared up at me, hair disheveled, sunglasses crooked, dignity nowhere to be found. "Karen," I said calmly, "you broke in again." Her response was immediate, furious, dramatic. "You don't understand," she snapped. "This cabin needs me. It's a safety hazard. The doormat is misaligned. The window trim is non-regulation height. The porch, don't get me started on the porch." One of the agents muttered, "Ma'am, please stop resisting," as she kicked off a shoe in protest. She twisted toward me as they lifted her to her feet, eyes burning with HOA-fueled righteousness. "If I don't enforce the rules," she barked, "chaos will spread. Mailboxes will clash with siding colors. Fences will vary by half an inch. People will start," she gasped dramatically, parking on the grass. I almost said something comforting. Almost. Instead, I simply sighed and watched the agents guide her down the path toward their vehicle, her ranting echoing through the trees like some deranged forest spirit shouting about landscaping guidelines. Her assistants were equally pathetic, one sobbing quietly, the other insisting he just came for the snacks Karen promised. By the time they were all loaded into the transport vehicle, things finally quieted down. The agents dispersed, scanning the perimeter, resetting lights, maintaining calm professionalism like this was just another Tuesday. I stood on the porch for a long moment, staring into the dark pines where Karen had emerged like a ghost armed with a clipboard. For a brief second, a strange feeling flickered in my chest. Not sympathy, not regret, more like relief. Because tonight proved something important. Karen wasn't unstoppable, she wasn't invincible, she wasn't some HOA demigod sent to plague humanity with citations. She was just a person, loud, unhinged, and spectacularly bad at stealth operations. I watched the last agent secure the perimeter and return to his post. The forest settled again. The night exhaled, and somewhere deep in the trees I swear I heard the faint echo of her voice shouting, "I'll be back. And I'll bring the violation manual." I rubbed my temples, the worst part. I absolutely believed her. The morning after the break-in felt oddly calm, like the world hadn't fully processed the chaos from the night before. Sunlight filtered through the pines with a gentleness that didn't match the memory of floodlights, shouting, or Karen flailing upside down in a tactical net. I had just sat down with a mug of coffee when my phone buzzed. Unknown number, government area code, never a good sign. I answered, and a stern, tired voice immediately filled the line. Is this the cabin owner involved in last night's event? The officer asked. Event, that was one way to describe Karen trying to break in with a crowbar and two terrified minions. Yes, I said, that's me, was a shuffle of papers on the other end. I'm calling regarding the individuals apprehended on your property, namely Karen Whitlock and her volunteer task force. Even over the phone, I could hear the hesitation as he searched for a professional word to describe her group. The officer cleared his throat and continued, We've completed our preliminary review. They are facing charges including trespassing, attempted forced entry, endangerment, illegal surveillance activities, obstruction of a federal operation, and several counts of harassment. I blinked. There were so many charges it sounded like a grocery list. Well, I said, that sounds about right. But the officer wasn't finished. And there's something else. Another pause, a heavy one. Ms. Whitlock is showing a fixation. I raised an eyebrow. On what? On the other end, the officer inhaled slowly, the sound of a man who had already spent too many hours discussing a suburban menace. Your cabin, he said flatly. She is, there's no elegant way to put this, obsessed with regulating it. I closed my eyes. Of course she was. She believes, he continued, that your property is in what she called a state of emergent code decay. She claims her involvement is necessary for community preservation. I said. She tried to break my window. Yes, with a crowbar, which, for the record, violated more than a few safety codes itself. I almost laughed. Then the officer's tone shifted, firmer, more serious. In light of her fixation, he said, the department recommends relocating the safe house. There's too much attention on that cabin now, too much risk. My stomach sank. I knew he was right. I'd known for weeks, maybe months, but I hadn't wanted to admit it. The cabin had become a battleground, one pine-scented conflict after another. Secret operations, shadowy figures, homemade booby traps, break-ins led by a woman who talked about mildew like it was a terrorist threat. The officer added, We'll send a team to assist with the transition. You should pack anything personal. We'll handle clearance. I looked around the room, at the faded rug, the wooden beams, the quiet fireplace that had seen more drama than a daytime soap opera. All right, I said softly, I'll get ready. By noon, the cabin was a maze of boxes. The tactical team moved through the house like an efficient swarm, unplugging equipment, wiping traces, sealing crates. They removed every piece of sensitive tech, every monitor, every encrypted device that had turned my mountain retreat into a federal hotspot without me fully realizing it. The emptier the cabin became, the larger the rooms felt. By late afternoon, it was nearly hollow. Quiet still. For the first time in a long while, the silence wasn't filled with the sound of agents coordinating or the static hum of surveillance gear. It was the natural silence of the mountains, the kind that used to comfort me. But now it felt foreign. My brother was the last to finish packing his gear. When he stepped out onto the porch, he carried something in one hand, a small, heavy metal device wrapped in a protective cloth. He handed it to me. A new lock. Thick brushed steel, military grade. This one's better than what we used before, he said. If anyone tries to force their way in, they won't get past it. I weighed it in my hand. Solid, cold, final. It felt like both a goodbye and a warning. He clapped a hand on my shoulder. You'll be all right, he said, but keep your guard up. Karen may be in custody, but people like her don't just switch off. No kidding. Once the last piece of equipment was hauled down the gravel path and the federal vehicles disappeared around the curve, I was alone. Truly alone. And for the first time in months, that was a relief. I installed the new lock on the front door. It clicked in place with reassuring heaviness, like sealing a vault. When I stepped back, I admired the clean metal lines, the immovable mechanism. It was the first time I felt safe, without a team of armored professionals standing on the porch. I walked outside and stood on the steps, breathing in the crisp mountain air. The woods were calm today, green and deep and unmoving. A far cry from flashlights and silhouettes and the shriek of Corinne declaring, "This porch is illegal." The shadows swayed gently with the breeze, not with intruders. No footprints. No snapped branches. No cheap perfume lingering where it didn't belong. Just pine needles. Bird song. The soft groan of the trees. It should have felt empty. It should have felt lonely. But instead, it felt like coming home to peace that had been on pause. And yet, beneath that peace, something else stirred. A quiet, stubborn truth. Corinne wasn't finished. Not really. People like her didn't retire from being self-appointed enforcers of imaginary regulation. They didn't fade into the background. They didn't sit quietly and reflect on their mistakes. They regrouped, they reorganized, they doubled down. I imagined her sitting in some temporary holding facility, surrounded by laminated rule sheets, muttering about fence ordinances and emergency planter guidelines. Plotting, planning, drawing diagrams no one asked for. Somewhere out there her clipboard was waiting. Her new task force would rise again, maybe bigger, maybe worse, maybe with matching jackets this time. I locked the cabin door one last time and turned toward the path, ready to move on. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that one day Corinne Whitlock would return. And when she did, God help the next property she set her sights on.